Hello everyone, today we're going to go through the subject report from May 22 for the personal project. If you're not aware of what a subject report is, it's the report that comes back from the examiners after each examination period for a subject. And they give some tips about, what could be improved in terms of the teaching of the subject or how the students present their work, etc. This is particularly valuable from the May 22 session for the personal project because it's the first year in which the new criteria were used. So there's a lot of great details in here to help for the next round of assessment. Of course, there was also around in November 22, but there's no subject report released for that session yet. So we're going to have to go with the May 22, especially now, this time of year when this video is posted. The students in most schools are getting from the May session are getting towards the point where they are creating their reports. So a lot of the tips and things from the report that we're going to go through will be relevant to that. Let's get into it. The first one is criteria A1. So all about the planning process. There's a few points here. They talk about in the subject report that there needs to be some more integration or a more developed connection between the learning goal and the personal interest. What they found was that some students had like discrete statements, one being the learning goal, one being the personal interest, and they were disconnected. It seems that there needs to be a much tighter connection between the two, between the learning goal and the personal interest, so that one links to the other. And that the personal interest needs to be explained and not just stated. They can't just say, I am interested in this. They actually have to explain and develop that connection. The learning goal as well, they mentioned how it needs to be very much separate and different from the product goal, and that the best learning goals went beyond like straight up learning the skills needed for the product itself, that they were a bit deeper than that. There's some great examples of those learning goals in the guide, actually, the kind of learning goals they're looking for. But something where it was, if you're doing graphic design and you're simply learning how to use a particular program, that wouldn't be going beyond, being completely separate from the product goal, right? And that they're looking for a deeper connection than that in terms of the skills that you'll learn about. So that's criteria A1 or strand 1 of criteria A. There's also some points in the report for strand 2 of criteria A. This relates to the criteria that the students set for their own report. And this is a big one, actually, because it's like a small point within this strand, but they're really emphasizing it, which is the justification of why the criteria that have been set are appropriate. Now, they've mentioned that this needs to be done separately to the table of criteria itself. If you use a table for your criteria, I personally suggest that my students use a table. And it can be a narrative, so some kind of descriptive paragraph underneath the table of criteria, or as a part of the table, as in like the final column, some kind of justification for the criteria. One point that was stressed was that any kind of specialist knowledge required to interpret those criteria cannot be assumed. So if you're making some highly technical product, maybe I've seen a student assembling a drone and their criteria references like highly technical terms that the average person can't be expected to know, you have to explain those terms. Basically, the students can't assume that the examiner has specialist knowledge in their area of study. So that can be a part of this justification for the criteria. There's also here where the plan has to be linked to the success criteria, and that in the plan, it must be clearly identified in which stages of the plan each criteria that's been created is being addressed. That's something that I can say from personal experience, my students didn't do a lot of in the May 22 session, but it is something that my students in the May 23 session will definitely be doing now that it's been put out in the subject report. All right, criteria B, strand 1 and strand 2, regarding the application of skills. So it's been very clearly stated here in the subject report that there should be separate sections for ATLs used in the learning and in the product goals. I moderated some reports where this wasn't clear. It was just a mishmash of ATLs. There needs to be, they mention it specifically, subheadings for learning goal, product goal, and underneath each one, the skills that have been used. I'm gonna, in a later video, share a format for reports that I use that does this, and I suggest that everyone does. I think it's better for everyone that there's a clear separation for students, for teachers, for moderators. Now, the best results came from students who did fewer skills in greater depth. In the format that, again, I'll share in a later video, I leave room for up to 3 ATL skills for learning goal and for product goal. This is certainly not, there's no minimum number of ATL skills, although I think 1 would be too few. So I think we're looking at somewhere greater than 1, but less than 4, right? So I think because if you have 4 or more, you can't cover them in great depth. So I think I think 2 to 3 well-developed skills that you can prove have been used in the project is probably the sweet spot there. But there is no hard and fast rule. The criteria itself doesn't specify a number of skills. You could certainly cover 1 skill in great depth and be successful. That would be my belief, at least. The students have to move beyond simply description of the skill or description of how it was applied. They have to actually provide in-depth understanding of what that skill means and how they use that skill. And the key is with evidence. In the old report, there was extensive use of things like appendices. They haven't outright said it in the report, but the new report, I believe, favors inline evidence. And I'm suggesting that students provide the evidence for the ATL reflection next to the reflection itself, rather than in an appendice in the end. So that's criteria B. Then C, the reflecting criteria. Now, the examiners were really, they were quite complimentary of the students' ability to reflect on the project impact. But the main area they had some points to make was in the analysis of the criteria and how it applies to the final product. Basically, the students need to be much more systematic and clearly analyze their product against each of the criteria in which they've set. There can be a tendency for students to have a large number of criteria for their project in the planning stage, and this can lead to some issues here at this stage of the project, because to actually get to the highest level in criteria C, they need to clearly and systematically analyze their product against each of those criteria. And if they've identified 6 criteria, then it really makes it a difficult task to do that. So given the amount of detail that's required to analyze the product against the criteria, I would suggest that students kind of cut down on the number of criteria, but maybe make each of those criteria more meaningful. A description of how the product matches the criteria does not address the command term analyze. We're going to talk about command terms in a second, but the command terms really stressed in these criteria strands. A lot of students use surveys or external validation to prove that they've met the criteria, which is great, but that must be analyzed as well and not just presented. So, all of this detail is great, but just presenting it isn't enough. The students have to actually meet the threshold of analysis for the highest mark bands, and analysis is actually tough, right? It's a higher order skill that students find difficult. So They need to be very mindful of that when they're reflecting. Okay, so throughout the subject report, command terms come up again and again and again. And the examiners have stressed that more attention needs to be given to satisfying those command terms, right? So when grading, or when we're helping give feedback to students on the report, we actually need to be looking at the descriptor in the strand, but also in the command term that's used. And when making that decision on, which level within the criteria to award, we really need to make sure that the command term has been satisfied. You can have really well-written work that just doesn't meet the threshold for analysis, for example, and you can't award a grade at that level of analysis if it's not present, even if the work is really well written. So the command term and how it's been satisfied should be kind of the final decider on which level to award. And students should be aware of this while they're writing so that they can do their best to meet that threshold. Then we have the page limits. So the examiners mentioned that there weren't many reports that went over the page limit, which is good. The page limit, of course, is a new requirement. It used to be a word limit rather than a page limit. Now it's a page limit with no word limit. So you've got 15 pages to, present all of your information, not more. So students were still including cover pages, tables of content, and other unnecessary items that do count to page limit, and took away from, the availability of pages that they had for their report. One thing to note with this is bibliography is considered separate, so you can actually upload a separate document for bibliography. And one problem that can be encountered with this is if there is a cover page and then 15 pages of report, the cover page will essentially bump off that last page of the report. The examiners won't consider that last page of the report because it's the 16th page, and they're only considering up to 15 pages. One thing that I see students do again and again, no matter how many times you tell them, is they are including links, like links to, a online portfolio, pictures of their product, something. Links will not and cannot actually be followed by the examiners, and they can't be considered. So this is like a real hard, stop. Don't include links in the report. I've examined for other subjects, not personal project, and I can tell you that the system does not allow for the clicking of links. Not that they would anyway. So be really clear on this to the students. Everything that they want to be considered should be inside of the report that they present. Then the last thing I want to look at is the grade boundaries, which, is quite an important feature of the reports, and you should really be using this in internal moderations and marking for the new session. There's a few interesting points here. What is generally considered a pass, which is a 3, we can see is actually like a pretty low threshold. With the range of 6 to 10 for a level of 3, you only have to get 2 in each of the criterias. I don't want to say impossible to fail. There are definitely people who can not meet that threshold. But if a student presents a report with at least some of what's required, it would be close to impossible to get below that 6-mark threshold. When we're getting into 1s and 2s, from a personal experience, we're talking about people who have just simply not shown any effort at all. We can see as we go up that there's kind of pretty consistent scaling until we get to 7. So for a 4, we have, you could get a 4, 4, and a 3 across the 3 criteria. For a 5, you would have to get 5, 5, 5. For a 6, you would have to get 6, 6, 6. 7 is very interesting though. A 7, 7, 7 on the 3 criteria would not get you a grade of 7. We can see that the mark range is 22 to 24. making the minimum achievement for a 7 across the 3 criteria to be 7, 7, 8. Now, this is, I would say, slightly problematic because there are a lot of teachers and schools that are really reluctant to award that 8. I am. I mean, the threshold that I require to award an 8 is very high. What we have to be aware of, though, and what some teachers and schools are maybe not quite in tune with, is that awarding a 7 or an 8 doesn't require perfection. It simply requires the full satisfaction of the mark bands at that level. And sometimes teachers can be a little bit hard when it comes to awarding those 7s and 8s because they have this perception that it requires perfection, when it doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to satisfy the criteria. When given that there are lots of reports out there that do deserve 7s, when we're internally grading these reports, we need to be looking for opportunities for those high-level reports to award 8s, not just 7s. Because otherwise, if you award a 777 based on these mark ranges and grade boundaries, a report graded 777 is going to get a 6. And it might not fully or truly represent the student's effort. So we need to be really searching for those opportunities to award 8s, at least in some of the criteria, so that those students who have put in such a strong effort and produced really great reports will get the 7 that they deserve. One thing is that you're looking for what is present, what is not, and in general, the examiners will consider your grades when awarding their grade. And if they're a little bit uncertain, if they're looking at that top band of 7 to 8, and they're not sure if it's a 7 or if it's an 8, they can use your grade as, the tiebreaker. And that's why I generally suggest that teachers err on the side of positivity. They tend to anyway, let's be honest. They know the students, and there is a tendency for the internal grades to be somewhat higher than the moderated grades. But, I think it's important that we, if in doubt, go put the higher grade in for the students. And, if it's moderated down by 1, it's moderated down by 1. I think we need to, as teachers and supervisors, be as positive as possible and present the students' work in a way that can get them the highest mark possible. So basically not being too harsh. All right, so that's basically everything from the subject report that I wanted to share. In some later videos, I'm going to share the report format that I've developed for the new personal project. And I'm also going to go over the marking and moderation process and how I do that. And I'll share some resources along with those videos that you can view and download and use for yourself if you want to. If you want to catch those, hit the subscribe button, like the video, and I'll see you next time.